So my wife said, who is Ligeti?
Well, what can I tell you about him? He was my father, so...
Can I tell the true story?
The question is where to start.
I said, you have heard his music.
I would say he was a very complicated person.
He was like a crazy artist.
I think he was at his most sane when he was composing. The rest of the time he was a bit crazy, or a lot crazy.
Things are always very simple and very complicated at the same time.
There was in the man a very dark negative layer, and there was a tragical one.
It's in 2001 and it's in The Shining, and she immediately knew what I was talking about.
He was one of these incredibly charming, strange persons that would charm and disturb everybody. Disturb in the good sense of the term, in the sense that an artist should always disturb.
And he could be charming, he could be, but he had a destroyer's instinct, a deconstructivist instinct. It was, he could be very, very cruel.
And all these things, yes, we can find in his music, definitely.
It's tactile music, not only auditive, but I'm what is called synesthetical, like Messiaen, always imagining colors, forms, shape, volume, even certain movement, certain speed, and even gravity, smell. So all senses are melted together.
My first memories go back very early, but I can't tell you, actually, to be honest, what the earliest memory of my father is. I can tell you what the last memory of my father is because I was with him when he died. That was not good. My father was always away a lot because he would go into his room where he composed and stay there for long, long periods of time. And sometimes when I was little, I would visit him there. But then he also took a job teaching composition in Hamburg while I was growing up in Vienna, and I would occasionally visit Hamburg. But he was not a family man in the traditional sense, so I didn't really grow up around my father like you grow up. He was, to me, always more of a good friend than of a father figure, I would say. So my name is Lucas Ligeti. I'm a composer and musician, improviser, and I live in New York City and make music here and elsewhere.
I'm Michael Doherty. I'm a composer and professor of composition at the University of Michigan here in Ann Arbor, Michigan in the United States. When I was going to school at Yale in the 80s, early 80s, I was also the assistant to the jazz arranger Gil Evans in New York City. He did all these important recordings with Miles Davis and was the arranger. I read an article by Gheorghe Ligeti that he was interested in the music of Miles Davis, but especially in the arrangements of Gil Evans. I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. So I decided I would just fly to Hamburg and try to meet him. Went to the office of the president and said, I'd like to meet Gheorghe Ligeti. He said, oh. So he said, well, I'll call him. So he called him, and Ligeti said, send him over. Here he was, one of the most famous composers alive at the day. He would even take the time. Most composers of his stature would have said, I'm busy, what are you talking about? I went over to his apartment, and he talked to me for a while, and he said, why don't you go play something on the piano? And so I played. He said, well, can you play some jazz? And I played jazz. Oh, this is very interesting. And then he asked me, who do you work with? I said, Gil Evans. You work with Gil Evans? Oh, this is very interesting. And he asked me, what do you think of the music of Milton Babbitt? Now, Milton Babbitt was a composer at the time known for writing very austere 12-tone, atonal music. What do you think of Milton Babbitt? I said, I'm not very fond of his music. Then he said, then you can study with me.
Completely independent and free, with an unbelievable imagination,
colorful, dangerous.
Completely unique.
He influenced many people, inspired many people.
His fantasy was endless and borderless.
Had a sense of humor, certainly.
Yeah, he was definitely playful.
It's playful, but there's a real critical edge to what he does a lot of the time.
Amy Bauer, Associate Professor of Music at University of California, Irvine. The man I met while he was on a tour of America, spending a few days at several different universities, was exactly the man I had pictured just from studying his music. The sense of humor, the cosmopolitan grasp of politics, music, culture, all of these things. It was really kind of amazing to meet someone and have them completely fulfill your expectations of them.
Giorgio Ligeti was a man who enjoyed contradictions and lived with them in not only his personal life, but also in his music. You have tonal aspects against atonal aspects. You have rhythmically complex areas to very static areas. And I think this is how he was as a person as well. A very complex person who had different personas. You really never know who the real person was. Sometimes he was Harpo, sometimes he was Chico, sometimes he was Groucho. You never really know which one you were going to get.
Well, I'm Pierre-Laurent Aymar. I'm a musician playing the piano, and I've got the privilege to be Mr. Ligeti's pianist for 15 years. Well, there is certainly a lot that is in common in the music and in the man. First of them is this incredible imagination. The second of them is this need for quality in his craftsmanship. And the third of it, I think, was his need for extremes. This was somebody that had got a quite hard life. And certainly the hard, extreme situations that he had to live can be found in a kind of transposition in his compositions.
My name is Wolfgang Marx. I lecture in music at the School of Music, University College Dublin. But prior to that, I studied and lived for 14 years in Hamburg. Ligeti occasionally came in, gave talks to students, and I found him among the most interesting contemporary composers. The first impression, I think, was that it was completely different from most other contemporary music I had, as a student, encountered at that point. Whereas you have this intellectual curiosity, but not necessarily an emotional attachment to that degree. With Ligeti, it's different. I had this emotional attachment straight away.
I don't remember him reading to me, but I remember him telling me a lot of stories, fantasy stories. He was pretty good at making up fantasy stories, probably things he came up with as he was sitting at my bedside.
I think his personal experiences, particularly as a Jew persecuted during the Holocaust, then also even prior to that as a member of the Hungarian minority in Transylvania when it was Romanian, and afterwards when he was an intellectual in Hungary under the early years of communist rule. So he had to suffer a lot, and particularly, of course, during the Second World War and the Holocaust, when he lost most of his family and could easily lost his life himself.
Later on, he would tell me stories when I was maybe 8 or 10 years old. He would tell me stories about his own experiences, about, for example, World War II. He was already 16 when World War II started, how he almost died many times and rode on the top of trains because there was no space. So he would ride on the roof of the train. And he told me about how he would get on the rear of the train, if possible, because For example, there could be cables running near the top of the train, and then the people who were at the front of the train would get decapitated first. So he knew that when the heads were flying, it was time for him to duck. Those kinds of bedtime stories he used to tell.
His brother and his father both were killed by the Nazis in concentration camps. His mother ended up in Auschwitz. She was a doctor, so she was used there forced to help people like Mengele. And he said later she never talked about what she had experienced. But so he lost much of his immediate family. He himself was drafted into a labor battalion, sent to the front.
Most of the people that he was working with in forced labor, the forced labor camp, then were sent off to a copper mine in Serbia, and they all died. And by some lucky coincidence, he was maybe the first in line that didn't get sent there.
And many people alongside him got killed doing that, and he, by coincidence, more or less survived this.
At the end of his life, when he was sick, I think memories of his brother came back especially strongly, and he talked about it a lot. He wasn't an angry person, but I think he had a lot of anger, and it's understandable.
Everything is chance.
What kind of a coincidence is it that I'm alive?
It's just a chance, but the same interest in complex patterns, which are half disorder, half order.
Crazy. And then Stalinism.
Then he came back and studied music in Budapest. And then, of course, 2 or 3 years later, there was the communist takeover in Hungary. And he described how then a kind of society developed where you had no chance to do what you wanted.
Those two experiences, Hitler and Stalin, totally defined, I think, what he was about in many ways.
An essential aspect of Ligotiness is there's always kind of a distance there. It doesn't come across to me as cold music. It comes across to me as music that understands that these emotions that are evoked are so strong that you almost have to put them at a distance. You have to consider that melancholy. You have to fold that sense of mourning and regret. You have to hold it and consider it. There's nothing confessional about his music. There's nothing trite. But there's also nothing that's so abstract that it doesn't connect with listeners, and especially with people who appreciate the tradition.
And I think Ligeti, being unable to directly engage with it, doing it indirectly, has found 3 elements that I would call his kind of stylistic elements, and I think apply a certain sociological concept, which is called the concept of cultural trauma. Allusion is one, so he doesn't actually refer to particular compositions in a recognizable way, with some exceptions. There's an element that sounds a bit like Mahler, that sounds a bit like Liszt or something like that. So allusion means I go there, but I don't actually do it directly. Then there's the grotesque. He had a fascination with English writers. He loved Alice in Wonderland. That would have been his last opera had he had time to finish that. Exaggerating things to a degree that makes it absolutely impossible. That cannot be true. This is sort of imagination. But it sort of still tells you something about the world as he saw it or as he experienced it. So that is that element. And then the third one is the lament. How pervasive the element of the lament is in all his music, more or less, so from the earliest Hungarian pieces to the last pieces, the horn concerto, where in instrumental works as well as in vocal works you have an element that is a descending melodic line, chromatically descending usually, not exactly the way you would have had in Baroque times, maybe kind of where you have much more audible ones often, but it is there and it can be found. And that defines him as a composer, I think.
My name is Louise Duchesneau, and I was Ligeti's assistant for 22 years in Hamburg, and I'm a musicologist. He was, very marked by his whole history and all this, and he survived by chance. Many, many, many times he survived by chance. He had psychoanalysis his whole life. His whole life. I knew 3 of his psychoanalysts here in Hamburg, and his wife, who's also a psychoanalyst, Vera Ligeti is a psychoanalyst, said to me one day, he exhausts them.
You know, the time he lived in communist Hungary, that was a time where there was no hope to get any performance of a piece that was in any way experimental, pushing any kind of a boundary. So he composed without hope. He worked on his own pursuit of trying to find his own voice, his own language, but with no hope of an outlet. So he taught harmony and counterpoint. And then when he arrived in the West, through a number of lucky turns of fate, he was able to get to the center, kind of the epicenter of where new music was happening, which was mainly at the time in Cologne, very quickly.
I think he had the impression he was this refugee, you know. He didn't want to talk about his, you know, the horrible experience that he had lived through in the war and the Holocaust, his father and his brother, and everything that happened to him during the war, because nobody wanted to hear it. That's what he told me. Nobody wanted to hear that after the war.
I'm Christopher Fox, and I'm a composer, and I also write about music. A lot of the German radio stations gradually gathered the resources to commission lots of new music. And so in the 1950s, you get this generation of composers who I think probably had a real energy and then a real zeal, which tipped over into proper zealotry, I think, about what was possible, what as a young composer you should be doing, indeed what you had to be doing.
Well, I don't think he ever considered himself an avant-garde composer. When he came out, he fled from Hungary in 1956, all the music that he was wanting to listen to was banned in Hungary. So when he came out, it was like, forget everything that I did in Hungary. This is the new world. This is what I want to do. And so he went into this new world and met his great heroes. Stockhausen, he stayed at Stockhausen's house also in Cologne when he came out. Stockhausen was very kind to him. And Boulez, also a bit later, was also very kind to him. Immediately after leaving, he measured himself as the equal of all these great composers.
He was not an opportunist. So he, for example, wrote an essay on Boulez very early on that challenged Boulez's not only aesthetic, but also the consequence of the constructive aspects of some of his music. And he soon left behind that clique of serial music. He never bought that bag of tricks. He was never somebody who pandered, I think.
I always called him Mr. Ligeti, and I always kept, let's say, a professional distance. You had no choice but to know about the intimate things too. You had no choice because he had no barrier. His intimate life or his personal life was everywhere. But I tried as much as possible to keep it at a professional level, which he didn't understand. I was hired to alleviate his chaos. First time I went over. We had 2 rooms, one with a tiny dining room table and a big piano and his work table and everything, the floor, the piano, the sofa, everything was covered in about, I'd say a foot of scores, books, open books, newspapers, everything kind of lying around. If you went in his bedroom, it was even worse.
It's the way how I compose. No system, but somehow based on systems.
if you ask me how he composed, I have no idea. I just know what he liked, where he got ideas from. For instance, Night at the Opera, the Marx Brothers. Groucho Marx, he's got this tiny, 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 tiny little cabin. And he's, of course, with his, there's a stowaway in there, and there's Harpo Marx, and there's Chico Marx, and all this. And so he goes out of the room, and he says,
Stu! Yes, sir. I say, Stu. Yes, sir. What have I got?
Stuart, can I order something?
Juice, orange juice, grape juice, pineapple juice. Hey, turn off the juice before I get electrocuted.
So he starts ordering eggs.
And 2 fried eggs, 2 poached eggs, 2 scrambled eggs, and 2 medium boiled eggs.
And 2 boiled eggs.
2 hard-boiled eggs.
And Chico says, and 2 boiled eggs.
Hard-boiled eggs.
So this and that and this and that and this and that and this. He orders and orders and orders and orders.
And 1 duck egg.
He goes back into the cabin, and then start coming a stream of people.
We've come to make up your room.
Somebody to do manicure, the engineer to repair the heating.
Get in the room. Come on in, girls, and leave all hope behind.
The eggs start coming in and all this by about 10 waiters and all this. Till the room gets so crowded that you just feel everybody on top of each other. And he says, this inspired me to write a movement from the piano concerto. It has to be the 4th movement, which is his fractal piece, which starts with a little motive, and then another little motive, and then it gets very, very, very crowded and very, very complex. So everybody calls this the fractal movement, but it's actually the boiled egg movement, you see?
Stuart? Come right ahead.
And he told me that one day.
Hey, Stuart, waiting all
He wasn't reading Xenakis or Boulez or whatever. He was looking at this movie and he says, wonderful!
The artistic goal was always the highest. And this is what I loved in him. Somebody who has a target, a truth, and who is not ready to sacrifice in any kind of social gain for that. He was not a politically correct person by chance. He was sincere with himself and with his ideals. And that I respect more than anything else.
He was working on a piece. He would prepare by listening to everything he could. When he was working on his piano etudes, for instance, there was everything on his piano. All the scores were open. Schumann, Rachmaninoff, Prokofiev, Liszt, of course, Chopin, etc., Beethoven, and everything, Scarlatti. Once he had done this preparation, he had like an inner vision, an inner acoustic vision of the way that the piece should go. I have the impression he heard the piece as it should go in real time. And his task from then on, I think, was to find the technical means to realize this vision. It didn't always work. And that's why, there's, I think, 22 different pages for the first movement of the piano concerto.
When I'd been a student, I think I developed a sort of snobbery about the avant-garde. So my late 70s view was that a piece like Atmosphere was interesting, but only because it isolated techniques that Stockhausen had used somewhere else. It's a ridiculously simplistic view. And the reason that Ligeti is now, possibly of that generation of composers, the most performed, in fact, has a lot to do with isolating the things that actually were the most exciting musical things to emerge from the avant-garde. He actually genuinely created something new which excites people's ears. I think that's why Kubrick got so excited. That's why Ligeti's music does the job it does in 2001 and in The Shining, because he'd worked out, this is the thing that really is striking and new. And it's striking and new because it sounds striking and new, not just because it's ideologically striking.
Ligeti-ness, that kind of thumbprint. I think oftentimes for a lot of people who still think of the soundtrack to 2001: A Space Odyssey, it refers to a technique people have called micropolyphony, very tight chromatic lines, building surreptitiously into a large cloud of sound and then dying down. But I think it refers to any time when you have musical texture where you have lines of music that are starting out in a very regular fashion and soon become very disordered.
Well, I think Atmosphere is an incredible piece. It's still extraordinary. Music that sounded like that was obviously in the ether because there are all these composers who weren't necessarily in contact with one another, writing these sort of rich, complicated textural pieces. So Penderecki in Poland and Stockhausen's Carré, the things that Xenakis was doing in Metastasis, they're all coming at the same problem of how to write a music which floats, I think. It hangs there like a cloud, but it's a cloud which is changing, and it's changing in a sort of goal-orientated way, doing the thing that clouds really don't do.
We know that Ligeti taught counterpoint at the Budapest Conservatory. He was considered somewhat of a master in it, and I feel that most of his music is dominated by the control of individual lines. And I think that meant that he understood that the great masters of counterpoint were really all about pacing. It's all about how you take the lines to shape a piece more organically than you might. I think of it also as a counterpoint of textures, a counterpoint of timbre, a counterpoint that involves anything that can be explored over time.
The counterpoint in Atmospheres, even if you can't hear it, and the counterpoint in the Requiem, they work because he knows how to make counterpoint work. And that makes something which is simultaneously incredibly new, because it's the harmonic vocabulary is like nothing that had ever been heard in Western music before, but at the same time it sounds, there's a sort of familiarity about it, which is in a way it's very disturbing. Again, that's why I think it works, especially in The Shining.
Two typical areas of kind of investigation for him sonically, structurally, were, clouds, because there were so many little things going on that you could no longer hear the separate little things. So that's very, very intricately woven fabrics of sound. And another one was this idea of a mechanism that somehow has either taken on its own kinetic life or has gone somehow wrong, has broken. And in a piece like, for example, the Second String Quartet, you can hear both of those in different movements. In many of his pieces, you can hear these two areas. So these were areas that he was interested in.
I think when we think of Clocks and Clouds, we think of that dichotomy between what is maybe explicit and what is implicit, as well as the superficial dichotomy between what are often called pattern mechanical processes or repetitive processes, and those processes that seem to just flow together.
It's a bit like clockwork, and it runs its course, but after a while, it is like one little cogwheel is taken out.
you set up this little machine and then you let it run for a little while, and then in one's humanity something kicks in
And so the whole thing starts to disintegrate. It creates disorder, or the first of the piano etudes is called in French désordre.
I think there's also this fascination with the sense of a complexity that lies beyond full apprehension. How do you capture, really, the wonder of the world?
Oh, complexity, it's always the same. Life is some complex behavior pattern.
There's a human quality to the music. There's a great intellectual quality. At the same time, there's a human quality, almost a fragile quality, which allows the listener to come in to the music.
The famous first piano etude, Désordre, where you start out very ordered, but there's already a seed of the piece pulling away from a rhythmic order, pulling away from a melodic order, pulling away from a harmonic order, and spinning off into a kind of a crazy, humorous, almost terrifying, in the case of some of the etudes, work.
It can be linked again maybe to the grotesque, to the exaggeration. It looks like it's this, but it turns out to be something completely different. And ambiguity again, it looks like perfectly organized for a moment, but only for a moment.
So it's this kind of fascination with where does order and chaos begin?
That's the point where the genius kicks in.
So I don't like the attitude to develop a cliché and repeat it and have a trademark. I try to change after every piece.
These elements that I named before, they are there all the time, but the way in which they are specifically applied to the music then change over time. There's first, of course, the micropodophony. There's the play with nonsensical words as an aventure. Then there is the play with tuning systems that comes in later, and of course with rhythms, which goes back both to medieval music and to African music, particularly African music that he became acquainted with in the early 80s.
It's hard to describe, but in the 1980s, when I knew him, there were great divides in the music world, and a lot of composers were conflicted. If I wrote modern music, then I have to be like a modern music person all the time. I can't go see Star Wars. I mean, I have to be this very principled, austere person who's only a prophet of avant-garde principles of life.
I'm trying to do something, always balancing between the avant-garde nonsense and the neotonal modal nonsense, which I think both are worn out.
Oh, yes, this was Boulez. Boulez was doing the violin concerto. Well, he's sitting at a table with Pierre Laurent. Pierre Laurent is saying something very intelligent, and Ligeti is just smiling at him so fondly, as if this is the most wonderful and charming person I've ever heard, which he is.
You know, he was interested in so many disciplines in life. He was captivated by ethnomusicology, by neurosciences, by mathematics, by linguistics, by natural sciences, and so many others. Always incredibly curious.
I know a lot about mathematics, but I don't use calculations. I'm deeply interested in science and a lot of other things, not only science, even in music, as you hear.
He would meet you once or twice a month at his apartment. It would start at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and go until about 8 p.m. When you met him in his apartment, he dressed like a very cool hipster kind of guy. Like he wore blue jeans and he had sunglasses, you know. I think he was around 60 years old at the time I was working with him. So there would be about 8 students. Everyone was older. There were no young composers. I would say the average age there was probably 28 years old or so. I was the only American. What I remember is that when anyone showed their music to Gheorghe Ligeti in a lesson in the summer, he would say, "It's not original, you need to start over again." And he did it to every person who brought in a piece.
My roommate at the time was working on the first book of Etudes, and Ligeti coached her. And he was concerned that the Arc-en-Ciel etude didn't have the right feel. He said, imagine you're Bill Evans. It's 4:30 in the morning. There's a glass of, half-drunk scotch. I need to have that kind of a feel. And Sarah made the terrible mistake of asking Ligeti who Bill Evans was. Well, he just blew up and said, "How can you not know the great Bill Evans?" And then I asked him afterwards, "Why have you never mentioned this in any of your public interviews?" And he said, "Oh, the European composer in love with American jazz. Such a cliche."
It's funny, whenever I would talk about American pop music or jazz, he would get very excited. He wanted to know inside, like, who have I met? Who do I know? Do you know the Henry Mancini orchestration book? I look at that sometimes and I use some of the things from, the Pink Panther, He was the only composer I met of, the composers of his stature in Europe, like a Boulez, a Berio, a Stockhausen. He would talk about these composers a lot, actually. But these were composers his age who wrote extremely difficult avant-garde music. But they would not be interested in Michael Jackson. I can guarantee that. I took the Thriller album to one of the Gheorghe Ligeti seminars in Hamburg. Of course, the other composers were like, "Oh, this is trash," blah, blah. I'm like, "Hey, oh, no, this is very interesting. This drum machine. You could write interesting, rhythmically complex music with the drum machine. No, I think this multi-tracking is a very interesting idea." That always left an impression on me about how open he was to anything.
Some people consider me as a traitor of modern music. Take my 2 small harpsichord pieces, which are pastiche, or the horn, violin, piano trio, which in fact was considered as a criminal act.
Well, when I first got to Hamburg, Germany, I heard the world premiere of Gheorghe Ligeti's trio for horn, piano, and violin, which was a departure for him because it used some romantic music. And I remember afterwards he said, there was a group of people, he said, "I don't think Boulez would like this piece."
Can I tell the true story? A pianist, Mr. Besch, quite good pianist in Hamburg. And we were in the loo, pissing at the same time. And Besch told me he's playing with the best German horn player, who is Hermann Baumann, the Brahms trio, and with an excellent violinist, who is Gavrilov. So Besch told me, would I consider to write a horn trio which can be performed with the Brahms one? They wanted a Brahms theme. Brahms is not one of my favorites. They didn't like my answer, and then I was asked to write a dedication, homage à Brahms.
I recently heard the horn trio again. That's the work in which everything comes together. He can be a sort of complete version of Ligeti because he doesn't have to impress anybody any longer because everybody knows that he's really good. remember in the early 80s people saying, well, you know, what is Ligeti doing, creating this ridiculously romantic work? And actually all he was doing was connecting together all the parts of his life that had been, he'd compartmentalised to a certain extent before that.
It's a game, it's something playing with tradition, but in the wrong direction, I would say.
Well, the other aspect that is, I feel, always there is the sense of kind of melancholy and nostalgia, but in a very considered sense. So the horn trio, of course, was felt, you know, it shocked some people in that it seemed to be paying direct homage to the past. But I think it brings every piece that he composed afterwards, brought all these elements together from his earlier career, the elements of the folk tradition, of Bartók, of the non-Western influences from African music. And there's that wonderful lamento that ends the horn trio, which kind of seems to sum aspects of the Western classical tradition and the folk tradition and this kind of grand mourning for the past. And I think there's also kind of a nostalgia for the promise of modernism, that modernists ferment in the late 50s and the 60s, and it never really bore the kind of fruit that it could have. It became stagnant, I think he felt.
He's so present in his creation. That is so incredibly alive. And the imagination, the strength, the depth, the spark, the humor, everything is here. You know, you just have to open the scores. Well, make this music a part of your life. And then it seems that he is here still. Well, I'm Pierre-Laurent Aimard.
My name is Louise Duchesneau.
I'm Christopher Fox.
My name is Wolfgang Marx.
Amy Bauer.
Michael Doherty.
So my name is Lucas Ligeti. I never studied with my father, but one thing we did used to do, we used to talk a lot, and we used to criticize each other. And, well, now I have, I don't have a choice because he's dead, so the distance is there. But I find myself feeling closer to his music somehow. I've realized that I'm never going to be far away from him in a certain sense anyway.